You want to build a leader. Where would you begin? So it's so interesting. Daniel and I were traveling this last week, and he got a text from a friend of his. This is a direct quote. And it said, "I am in this senior leadership training with a very small group of leaders, and my soul is dying." That's what he said. And he went on to say, "We spent an hour talking about creating a safe space instead of actually getting into conversations where we got to experience one." So we had a good laugh. We're all trying to do this better and better. But so if you're trying to build a leader, you're trying to develop a person who will go first and lead, where would you begin? And those of you who know me know this about me, that I truly, when I look at any issue in our world, and there are big issues today, let's be context relevant, right? But the big issues that we're seeing across our news, there are other issues that are not being shown that are also apparent. And one of the things that I feel deeply convicted about is that any major movement of change in our world will require at least two things: the awareness of a deep need and a leader. And so often we don't talk about that. We just do not talk about the necessity for people who will go first with courage and a character of sacrifice that would actually lead out into our world. Because you think about any initiative that's going to change anything, it's going to require those two things. We have to be an awareness of the need and really be able to understand that. But then it's going to take someone who's going to step out and do something about it, and step out and go first, and hopefully go first well. So let me talk to you about three fundamental reasons that typical leadership development leaves us wanting. And I'm not blaming other people, by the way, because I think these are things that we could all continue to work on together. But here are a couple of things. One is that oftentimes they're based on something that we already know, and we just have kind of retitled it. It'd be like if we were going to build a house. Okay, we're going to build a house, and we know that most homes have a roof. I think most, or if not all, if I'm not mistaken, have a roof. And then we kind of know that, right? We know that if we're going to build a house, you got to have a roof. But then we see a best-selling book about building houses called Coverings, and we think it's new, right? But it's still fundamentally about building a roof. And we know that just because we call it something different doesn't mean that it actually is something new. So I think one of the realities is that we actually are not acting on what we already know. We're just kind of refacing it. And then the second thing that's related to that is that so often when you see leadership development is postured as outcomes. So we see things, we talk about the outcome as if that's what it's about. So imagine this: trust is an outcome. So if you write a book and you say, like, leaders should develop trust in their organizations, like trust, we're all like, amen to that, because we say amen to that because we've experienced non-trust, right? So we know that it's an outcome. It tells us nothing about how to build trust. You know, and you can name anything that's out there, like and I'm not picking on things. I'm just saying these are outcomes. And when we make the outcomes the goal, we miss the reality of what it means to actually do it better. So you take any concept that's important that's out there, whether it's resilience. Resilience is an outcome. It also may be a driver as well. But I'm just saying, like, what does it mean to build resilience? So you take any topic. So a lot of times we're focusing on the outcomes. We don't actually talk about the real story of what it means to develop a person as a leader. And then the other thing is this: that it offers us one part of the whole story and calling that a leader. It'd be like looking at you ever looked at the unfinished framing of a house that sat in your neighborhood and didn't get finished for some reason? And it'd be like looking at the framing of a house, all the wood structure, and saying, okay, that's a house. So let's just teach people to build framing and call that house building. All right. So it's like, but we do that all the time. I think the challenge is that there is a lot that goes into building a leader or building a house to actually develop a leader. So I'm going to roll with the house. All right. I want you to roll with that for me with just a second, because I'm kind of fascinated by this. I know Daniel's been through the house building process, so he's got a lot to say about this, but he's muted. So he doesn't even get to respond, which is, so we'll talk about this later. So when you think about building a house, like, the reality is that the fundamentals of building a house probably haven't changed that much. There are certain technologies certainly that are making, but there are certain fundamental things that we probably have thought about even since the beginning of time. And so in the end, it's going to still be about building a shelter that you like, all right, hopefully, that is designed to your custom desires and needs and is a shelter of some kind. And the fundamentals around, just think about some of the fundamentals around house building, even before we get into some of the structural pieces, is like they are relational spaces typically. Even if you live alone, that people would actually come into, and there will be relationships that will generate there. They include paradoxical choices between options. When we built a roof over our patio, one of the fundamental, there's no good or bad in this, but these are choices we had to make that my wife and I may experience as good or bad later. But when we built a roof over our patio, one of the choices we had to make is, we live in Seattle. I don't know if any of you know this, but it rains often. Okay, so we had to make this choice on how big is the roof. But the problem was, the bigger the roof, the less sunlight that was coming into our kitchen. So there wasn't a good or a bad, but in the end of it, we might experience as good or bad based on those choices, right? So there's paradoxical things, these tensions that are competing, where we're trying to kind of solve this thing. All these things that, it's that also that a long haul perspective is necessary. Some of the fundamentals, like if you build a home, you got to think about water. We don't even want to go there because I know some of you have very traumatic experiences about water in homes. So you know what I mean? Like if you didn't think about water, there are some long-term implications for your home, right? For your house that must be thought about. And that maintenance will be required. Updating will be required. That architecture will matter. And architecture is the fundamental process of putting it all together. The architect thinks about the plan. If that's the fundamentals, let me just, for myself, think about what are the things that go into building a home. And I consulted with some of my expert friends who could build a house with their bare hands tomorrow for you. So just know that I did get some expertise in this. But here's a few things: a purpose, a reason for its existence. Who will it serve? What does it need to be good for? How many people will live in it? For how long? You know what I mean? Like you're going to think about these things, hopefully, before you build a house. A context. What I mean by that is an environment in which it will exist. Seattle versus Phoenix, right? I mean, I got to bring up the Seattle thing. It's just different, right? It's just different. It's different. You're going to have to think about some contextual factors. A foundation, a base upon which it will stand. A frame, a structure defining the shape, right? You're probably going to have some kind of a frame. Even, there's new technology coming out, but in some ways there could be a combination of things, but you're still going to have a framing. A joinery. I was looking for the word that represents like nails and things that connect all those different pieces together. And there's actually a whole part of carpentry called joinery. If you didn't know that, it's something that connects all the pieces together, the nails or the joints. An exterior that serves to protect and is what others will immediately see and experience. A roof, of course, a covering, a resource, a way for energy. Like if you're building a house, an architect has to think about, where do we get power? Where do we get water? And how does it flow through the home, right? We're going to think about this. A climate, a stability in the climate, regardless of the storms that are existing outside. So in most cases, even if you were a cave dweller, I wasn't a cave dweller. I don't know if any of you were. I mean, I've been in caves, but like if I didn't have a home and I was like lived in a culture where we found caves, I bet climate's going to matter. Like it's going to be, I'm going to find a cave, right? And those of you who've been caving, which I have, the deeper you get into caves, there's a stable temperature. You know what I mean? Which is interesting. There's a stable temperature. A character. When you walk into a house, that experience when you walk into a home and you say, this house has character. It's a funny word, isn't it? Because it's describing a feeling that a home gives us that might be different depending on who else is interacting with it. But it's kind of the combination of all the pieces that are a part of it. And then also, good bones is interesting too. I see that. And then the last thing is this, a calling. I bet you never thought about a calling with regard to a house. A calling, an emerging and transcendent reason for it being there at a given time in history. Think about this. I don't know about you, but my home was built in about 1980. And there's 3 different families that have lived in that house since then. And so that house sort of being called to serve in different ways, depending upon, you know, who will be living within it and who will come through the doors. And then finally is this, and editing. So I don't think we think about this in the original architecture very often, but think about this: update or remodeling, editing along the way, things that will go wrong, a process for editing. I actually have a fence that's down in my yard. It's driving me crazy. I am relatively handy, but I don't like to do fence building in the winter. So I'm waiting for summer. So I have a giant steel rod holding up this part of my fence that is probably going to fall as we speak right now. So it's like the editing and maintenance process is necessary. I tell you this when we think about that. So I'm going to jump now. You know, by the way, metaphors run out. My brother wrote a whole chapter on this a while back. Like, metaphors are powerful things. Analogies are powerful things, but at some point they will run out. But I think this is a powerful way to think about what it means to build a leader. And one of the main differences is that between a human being as a leader and that house I just described is that a home does not have agency. A home does not have the capacity to choose. We're talking about human beings. When we talk about building a leader, if we don't pay attention to the reality that we are talking about a human meaning coming from the dirt, like this is a real thing, a human incarnate in the flesh, a person with a psychology and a soul and a belief system and all these things that go into part in relationships, that it does get more complicated. But I think there is something to pay attention to there. Daniel and I were just in Spring Arbor, Michigan. And I tell you this because we went back there. It's where I was born. We moved to Seattle when I was 5 weeks old. And my dad took a different job. And when Daniel and I went back there, we went back to work with a client organization. We got a chance to see Dick Freed. Hey, Dick. It was awesome to see Dick. I think it was the first time we met face to face, although I had seen Dick when I was in like high school, which is a longer story. But so we had this moment to be back there. And we were in this moment. I got to speak in the chapel, in front of 600 students in the chapel where my grandfather was a pastor. It was also the same like real estate where my parents were married. It was just this amazing moment. I got to work with a client, and Daniel and I got to do a forum on campus. It was amazing. And a woman came up to us after I had talked about what it means to do whole leader development. She was a sophomore and she's in tears. And all we were doing was describing the reality of leading. And she came up to us and she said, I mean, she's crying. And she said, no one has ever described what my last year of leading for the first time has been like. The reality of what that's like. And so we were just like so critical to develop her capacity. And then this 93-year-old guy came up to me. And the first thing he said was, I was the principal at your mother's, the elementary school where your mother taught first grade. And he said this 93-year-old guy. And he said, what I wish when I heard your talk is I wish I could be young again so that I could go back and hear this and begin to lead again. And I think this concept of like, if we thought more intentionally about what it means to develop a whole leader, what would be different for her and for him? And so when we think about the research, what I want to describe to you is, this is what's fascinating from my perspective is I have had 25 years to teach a class. I taught a class every Tuesday night from 5:30 to 8:30 for 25 years. And it was some version of the class called organizational behavior. It's everything we know about organizing and leading and the deepest theory and psychological research around that. And one thing that is fascinating is that it's a multifaceted process. And any organizational behavior text has at least 16 chapters of what we know. So to actually build a leader means to pay attention to all these things psychologically that are important. So I'm not going to get deep into the research because I could geek out all day long. And if you're interested in that, apply to our Executive Fellows program or come to a WiLD Experience Intensive because we'll get into some of that deeper theory and research. But let me tell you that from that same perspective of a house, I want you to think for just a second. Think about your existing paradigm for developing a leader or yourself, and even inviting yourself into this, and think about these different components of what's actually going on that we know are going on, that if we could tie those things together. So the first thing is this: on the fundamental side, just like that home that might be used, we have to deal with paradoxes, that there will be paradoxical choices that a leader will be required to make. One simple choice is between, do I pay attention to what's important to me, or do I pay attention to what's important to my multiple stakeholders who may think something different? That's just one example. and in maintaining their capacity to make a choice. Because all of you, I look at your faces, I know the leadership challenges so many of you have faced, and like that concept of agency and my capacity, like when I say choice, my ability to continue to make a choice as opposed to responding out of compulsion throughout my lifetime. So that's one of the fundamentals. The other thing is this, is that a long haul perspective, just like that house, is to step back and say, when we're thinking about developing a leader, we're looking at it from a long haul lens. Like, how can you imagine if we made an intentional investment today in developing a generation of courageous and sacrificial leaders? What would the future look like 20 years from now? If that girl who came up crying, that young woman came up crying, she's a sophomore. You know, maybe because of this moment, if she gets surrounded now with some structure, what will look different for her? And then the last thing is this, is under the fundamentals, is a common language. Did you know that how much heat that Abraham Lincoln took when the railroad was built across the United States? He made a decision to build tracks that were to build the railroad actual tracks the same size at a standard size. And without that, we would not have had rail cars that fit on all the, we'd have had different cars for different tracks. It would have created a disconnection. And there was incredible, and now imagine the information that passed across our country. Now, I understand that there were costs paid by different people. So I'm not minimizing that as well, but do know this, that there are pathings between that choice that Abraham Lincoln made and putting people on the moon. So the reason why I say that is that at some point we have to make a decision about a common language and framework, which is a lot of the work that we do. So let me talk about the different pieces of the house. A purpose to build a leader, the answer to why you're here. Why are you here? Not just in general, in this moment, leading in this particular organization, leading in your family. Why are you here? And what is it that you can't help? Another part of that purpose is, what is it you can't help but do well? Or what are some of your blind spots? A context. We know leader development research is clear that leader development occurs within an organizational context or a relational context typically. So the fact that some of you are in excavation, plumbing, higher education, government work, accounting. I'm just looking at the screen. You're a student right now. You know what I mean? You're actually an influencer and leader. You're leading within aerospace. You're leading within a state government. You're leading within the sports field. You know, it's like, I'm just looking at all your faces. I haven't even named all of you, but it's like those contexts are the place where so much developmental capacity is developed. So understanding that context is very important. A foundation. We know from development literature that this is important. Your personality, including in your readiness and your potential, your readiness to learn and to grow, that foundation is what's important. We also know this, a frame. And I want to describe this as the experiential frame shaping the person that you are today. There is research to support that that's how it happens. So that frame is important. A joinery. Okay, I talked about nails on the house, things that connect it together. The amazing thing about human beings is that the people that we are surrounding and the people who surround us create the ongoing living linkages and the structural connections, connective tissue that creates that allows that structure and that frame to exist. A resource. Motivation theory is a massive player in the development of leader capacity. So understanding motivations as the energy that's pushing through a person is so critical. I'm going down the list, y'all. I know Claire's putting these in the chat, I think, so you got them with you, but it's a lot. But that's the point, right? It's a lot. A climate. Think about this. We walk into a house and we experience a climate, a presence that is deeply rooted in who and whose we are. So that we aren't kind of flowing with the whims of the story. That's why I write a whole book about this. We've done tons of research on leading under pressure. How do we maintain our composure regardless of what's happening around us? A character. This word, we talked about, this house had character. Who you are and who you are becoming. And an external expression of that person. What is it that other people will experience being around you that's so difficult to wrap up into a clean little box? but it's like that house that has certain characteristics that are difficult to describe. It's that imprint of it all on who we are that people then feel and experience. A calling, a transcendent summons to be ready to serve in a different way. Like that's a tough thing. We don't always talk about it. It's one thing like to say like purpose is important. It's another thing to say, yeah, I was designed for a specific purpose, but I also am willing to listen to this transcendent summons to serve that may or may not be something I want to do or feel like I'm ready to do. And then this, and editing. We talked about the remodeling of the house, a continuous process of becoming based on who you are and who you might or must become in service to others. This process, like, would any of us want a leader who is not willing to edit? I got to say it again, like, please shake your heads. No. Would any of us want a leader who's not willing to edit? But here's the paradox of that. We expect tremendous conviction and clarity and fortitude in a person, and we want them to edit. And to that, I say yes. Yes. And that's why part of the mission of WiLD is to develop courageous and sacrificial leaders, a strong sense of ourselves and the willingness to say, I may need to sacrifice part of that to lead well for the sake of people around me. And so I just want you to imagine the implications for theory, for research, for practically how we think about and do leader building in our organizations and our communities. There are huge implications to just begin to do that. And I will tell you shamelessly, this is what WiLD does all day long. This is what I've spent my life trying to invest in, is a whole leader development, a way that we could actually develop a common language and a structure for doing. This is the nature of our work. But for each of you, I know your brains, you have so much, this is where we crowdsource this. Here's the question I have. What are the implications of what it means to build a whole leader, as I just described it, for your organization or for your thinking? Like for some of you, there are people on here who were clients of mine 20 years ago. And if we could have had this conversation years ago, how amazing this would have been. What are the implications for doing that?